On a cold October evening, sometime in the 1880s, high in a mountain pass on the border of what would become Idaho and Montana, two trappers made camp. They were hard men, experienced men, the kind who had spent their lives in places that killed soft people very quickly. They knew how to read weather, how to read tracks, how to stay alive in a place that wanted them dead. But 1 week later, only one of them would come back down out of those mountains alive.
The other was found stretched out on his back beside a fallen spruce log. His body was still warm. His neck had been snapped clean, and 4 deep puncture wounds had been torn into his throat. He had not been robbed, his gear was untouched, and most disturbing of all, he had not been eaten. Whatever killed him had done it for no reason a sane man could name, and then it had simply turned and walked away on 2 legs into the timber. Now here's the part that should stop you cold, the part that makes this different from every other story like it. We do not know this from some anonymous post on a forum. We do not know it from a tabloid or from a campfire rumor that swelled and twisted in the retelling over the years. We know the story because the man who survived it told it decades later to one specific person. And that person was Theodore Roosevelt. The same Theodore Roosevelt who would go on to become the 26th President of the United States. He wrote it down. He put it in his own book under his own name, and he made it unmistakably clear that he believed the man who told him. That is not nothing. That single fact changes what this is. This is not a tall tale. This is the real deal, and we are going all the way into it today, from the first night to the last. Because whatever did this was not hunting for food. It killed a grown man, and it left every scrap of him lying in the dirt. And the mountains where it happened are still out there tonight, still empty, still swallowing experienced, careful people who walk in and never walk back out.
I'm Alex, and I have gone back through Roosevelt's own pages, line by line, to put the whole thing back together for you, piece by terrible piece. Stay with me because the details do matter here. The man at the center of this story is named Bauman. Everything you're about to hear, every sound in the dark, every track in the mud, comes down to us through him and what he told Roosevelt. And it comes down through one of the most credible witnesses in all of American history.
So let me introduce you to him properly, because he matters more than almost anyone we have ever covered on this channel. His name was Bauman. Roosevelt describes him as a grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter, a man of German blood who had spent his entire life out in the deep wilderness. He was not a tourist, he was not a greenhorn. He was a professional at surviving the kind of country most people would not last a week in. By the time this story finally reached Roosevelt, Bauman was an old man near the end of his life. And here's the thing that gets me. Even then, even decades after it happened, the fear was still fresh in him. When he told it, this hardened old hunter who had faced down everything the frontier could throw at a man, he could barely keep himself from shuddering. That detail comes straight from Roosevelt, and we are going to come back to it because it is everything. I want to sit on this point because it is the entire foundation of why we take this seriously instead of filing it away with the campfire stories. Theodore Roosevelt was not a gullible man. He was a soldier, a rancher, a trained naturalist who had personally hunted and studied nearly every large animal on the continent. He knew the difference between a bear and a bear story. He was famously, almost aggressively skeptical, the kind of man who demanded evidence and sneered at superstition. He did not scare easily. He did not believe in goblins or ghosts or things that go bump in the night. He spent 600 pages of that book writing about the hard, observable facts of frontier life, the animals, the weather, the land, the work. And buried in those 600 pages of fact is this one story, the one that does not fit, the one that should not be there at all. And he put it there on purpose, knowing exactly how strange it would look. Something about the way Bauman told it got through to him. Something about watching a man that tough, a man who had stared down grizzlies without flinching, go pale and tremble while reliving a memory from his youth, convinced Roosevelt that whatever else was going on, this old hunter was not lying. He believed something had happened, and so Roosevelt wrote it down and stood behind it. That tells you something powerful about how it must have been told. I personally think that is the single most important fact in this entire case, and I want you to hold on to it. Bauman was the last man on Earth you would ever expect to be rattled by anything. Roosevelt was the last man on Earth you would ever expect to write down a monster story. And yet here we both are, more than a century later, with these two specific men pointing directly at the same impossible thing standing in the dark woods. When two people like that agree, you stop laughing and you start listening. Now let me put you in the country Bauman lived and worked in, because the land itself is a character in this. We are talking about the Bitterroot region, the rugged tangle of mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon River from the headwaters of the Old Wisdom River, what people today call the Big Hole. This is the Beaverhead Range, some of the steepest, blackest, most unforgiving timber in the entire American West. Even now, in our time, this country is nearly empty. You can stand in parts of it today and not see a road, a light, or another human being in any direction. Back in the 1880s, it was the very edge of the known world, a blank space on the map, the kind of place men disappeared into for months and where, if something went wrong, no help was coming. Not in an hour, not in a day, not ever. This was beaver country, and that is what brought men like Bauman into it in the first place. The fur trade. The work meant going in for weeks at a stretch, alone or with a single partner, setting and running trap lines along the cold creeks and beaver ponds, packing out the pelts on your back or on a pony, living off what you could carry in and what you could shoot or trap along the way. It was brutal, lonely, dangerous labor, and the men who did it were a breed apart. There were no roads up there, no cabins to run to, no rescue, no witnesses to anything. If the mountains decided to take you, they took you, and they closed over the gap behind you like you had never existed at all. A man could die in 100 ordinary ways out there: a fall, a flood, a bad storm, a wounded animal, the cold. Everybody who went in knew the risks. Bauman knew them better than most. He had been doing this for a lifetime. But Bauman carried something else into those woods besides his rifle and his traps, and this is going to matter at the very end of the story. He had been raised on the old country lore, the ghost and goblin tales of the deep German forests, the stories his people had told for centuries about the things that lived in the dark between the trees. That kind of thing sinks into a child and never fully leaves. And out here in the American wilderness, he had heard the other stories too, the ones the native tribes told. Tales of the snow walkers, tales of tall things that stood upright in the timber and were not men and were not bears and were not anything you ever wanted to cross paths with. These were not bedtime stories to the people who told them. They were warnings, passed down because somebody at some point had learned the hard way. If you had asked Bauman straight out, he would almost certainly have told you he did not believe a word of any of it. Most of these men would have said the same. You cannot do that kind of work and jump at every shadow and every strange sound in the night, or you would lose your mind in a season. But the stories were in him all the same, sitting quiet and patient in the back of his mind, waiting. And up in that pass, on that one trip, something reached in and woke every single one of them up at once. So Bauman and his partner set out for a high beaver valley, the kind of untouched basin where the trapping would be rich and the competition would be none. It was a good plan, a smart plan even. 2 capable, experienced men, a full season's work laid out ahead of them, in country they understood as well as anyone alive. There was no earthly reason to expect this trip would be any different from the 100 others each of them had made before. But to reach that valley, to get to the good trapping ground, they had to go up and over one particular mountain pass. And that pass had a story attached to it, a dark one, a story that Bauman already knew, that he carried in his head before he ever set foot on the trail leading up into it. Because something had happened in that pass. Recently, the year before, just 1 year earlier, a lone trapper had gone up into that exact same pass. One man, working entirely by himself, doing precisely what Bauman and his partner were now setting out to do. He went up into that high timber to run his line and pull his furs. It should have been routine for him too. And he never came back down out of those mountains. Not that season, not ever. He simply went up and he was gone. And here's how the world found out what had happened to him, which is a detail that makes my skin crawl every time. A group of mining prospectors had been moving through that same high country. They had actually camped near the lone trapper, close enough to know he was up there, alive and apparently well, just the night before. They knew he was fine, they had seen him, and then when they passed back through the area a short time later, he was dead. Whatever had found that man in the pass had found him fast, and it had found him close. He went from alive and healthy to dead in a terribly short window, in a place where supposedly he was the only living soul for miles. And when the prospectors came upon what was left of him, they found that the remains were half-eaten. Something had killed that man, and then it had fed on him. I need you to sit with that for a moment because it becomes enormously important later when we get to the second death. The thing in this pass, whatever it was, had at least once killed a human being and treated that human being as food, as prey, as a meal. That is a known, ordinary kind of horror. A predator eats. We understand a predator that eats, even when it is hunting us. Remember that this killing made a kind of grim sense. The next one will not. And Bauman knew all of this, every bit of it. His partner knew it too. They were not walking into that pass blind. They stood there at the foot of it, with a dead man's story hanging over the whole place like a fog, a pass that had already taken one of their own kind within the last 12 months. And then they shouldered their heavy packs and they walked up into it anyway. Hold on to that image. 2 experienced men walking willingly into the one place they had every reason on earth to fear. I want you to really understand these 2 men before we go any further up that trail, because in a very short while, one of them is going to be gone. And I do not want him to be just a body to you when it happens. And here is a quietly awful thing. We do not even know his name. History remembered the survivor, Bauman, and it completely forgot the man who died beside him. He went into those woods a whole person, with a life and a history and people who knew him. And he came out the other side of this story as nothing more than Bauman's partner. What we do know is that they were a working pair, and a good one. Competent, comfortable with each other in the way that men only get after they have shared a lot of hard country together. They moved well as a team. They trusted each other to do the work, to carry their share, and most of all, to watch the dark while the other one slept. That trust, that bond between 2 capable men, is the exact thing that is about to be tested and then shattered in the worst possible way. So keep them human in your mind as we go. It makes everything that follows land the way it is supposed to. They made it up and over the pass and reached their valley, and they found a good spot to base out of. A place thick with game sign, exactly the kind of ground a trapper dreams about finding. Plenty of beaver, plenty of promise. They built themselves a lean-to, a simple, open-faced shelter set up to face the warmth of a fire, the standard arrangement for men who plan to be in one place for a stretch of days. And here's the important part. At first, everything was completely normal. Calm even, pleasant. The work was good and the country was delivering on its promise. There was no sense of dread, no feeling of being watched, none of the things you might expect. Just two men doing a job they were good at in a beautiful and remote place, settling in for a productive run. I point this out because it makes what comes next so much sharper. The horror in this story does not announce itself. It walks in quietly on an ordinary day when their guard is down. So they did what trappers do. They set their line and they spent the full day out working it, moving through the timber and along the creeks, placing and checking their traps, ranging well away from their little camp and leaving it sitting there empty behind them. It was a completely ordinary day's labor in extraordinary country. Nothing about it raised an alarm. And while they were gone, out of sight and out of earshot, something came to their camp. They came trudging back toward evening, tired and hungry and looking forward to the fire, and they found their lean-to torn down. Now, I want to be precise about the language here because Bauman was. It had not blown over in the wind. It had not collapsed on its own. It had been torn down. Their packs had been pulled apart and rifled through. Their bedding was flung and scattered all around the clearing. Their gear was thrown everywhere. It was as if something large and powerful had moved through their camp and methodically, deliberately pulled the whole place apart. And here's the detail that separates it from an animal just nosing around for food. It did not seem to be searching for anything in particular. It seemed to be wrecking the place, making a mess of it, almost as if it were sending a message, the way you might trash a room to frighten the person who lived in it. That is a strange and unsettling thing for an animal to do. And then they found the thing that, honestly, should have sent them packing right then and there, that very evening. The tracks, they were everywhere, pressed deep into the soft ground all through the camp and around it. And when the two men crouched down to read them, the way men who live their whole lives by reading sign would do automatically without even thinking about it, the tracks told them something that did not make any sense at all. Whatever had done this had walked through their camp on two legs. Now here is what real people actually do in a moment like that. And I have always respected that Bauman's account is honest about it instead of pretending they were braver than they were. They did not panic and flee. They talked themselves out of it. A bear, maybe, they said, reared up on its hind legs. A rival trapper playing a vicious practical joke. Some explanation, any explanation at all, that would let them rebuild the shelter and stay the night and keep working their valuable line. Because the alternative, the thing the tracks were actually plainly telling them, was not something any sane, rational man wanted to let into his head. It was easier to reach for the comfortable lie. And I do not blame them one bit for it. You and I, sitting here listening now with the whole story laid out in front of us, we already know better. We already know what was out there. But they did not have that luxury yet. They only had a wrecked camp, a set of impossible tracks, and a long night coming on.
What happened that night is the moment Bauman never stopped reliving, and decades later, telling it to Roosevelt. And that is the part where the hardened old hunter could barely keep his voice steady. Keep that in mind as I describe it to you.
So they rebuilt the lean-to. They gathered their scattered gear, set the shelter back up, built the fire, and prepared to spend the night anyway. Night came down over that valley the way it only does in deep mountain timber, total and absolute, a darkness with real weight to it. The fire carved out one small flickering circle of orange light, and beyond its edge stood a solid black wall of trees going up and out forever in every direction. The two men lay down to sleep with their rifles close at hand, telling themselves the daylight explanations they had settled on, the bear, the prankster, the reasonable lies. And for a while there was nothing. Nothing but the soft pop and hiss of the fire, the deep cold settling in, and the enormous, pressing silence of the mountains all around them. Maybe they even started to relax. Maybe they started to believe their own story. And then it came back. Near midnight, Bauman came suddenly awake, and the very first thing that reached him before any sound was a smell. A thick, rank, overpowering stench of wild animal rolling into the open shelter on the night air, so strong and so foul that it pulled him straight up out of a dead sleep. Anyone who has ever spent real time around large wild animals knows that a smell like that hits you somewhere far older than conscious thought. It bypasses your reason entirely. It goes straight down into the most ancient part of your brain, the animal part. The part that has known for 1,000,000 years exactly what it means when a big predator is close. The part that knows instantly and without any words that you are prey. Bauman's body would have known he was in danger before his mind had even finished waking up. The smell told him. And then his eyes told him the rest. He saw it, there at the very entrance of the lean-to, blotting out the dim glow of the dying fire. There was a shape, a great dark bulk, a massive form standing exactly where the open mouth of the shelter should have been. Too big. The proportions of it all wrong in a way that the animal part of his brain understood even if he could not have put it into words. Something enormous was standing at the opening of their shelter in the dead middle of the night, close enough to reach out and touch, close enough that its stink had filled the entire structure. But Bauman did not freeze. He was far too experienced for that, too seasoned, his hands too practiced. In one motion, he brought his rifle up and he fired straight into the looming shape in the dark. A deafening crack and a blinding flash of muzzle fire in that black valley. The kind of shot that at that range should have ended absolutely anything. And then he heard it leave, not fall, not cry out, not die. He heard something huge go tearing off through the underbrush and the timber, crashing and smashing away into the darkness, leaving entirely on its own terms. Think about what that means. He had fired his rifle point blank at the thing standing in his doorway. And it had not dropped. It had not even seemed hurt. It had simply decided on its own that it was done, and it had left. Whether he hit it or missed it clean, the result was the same. It was unbothered. The two men did not sleep again that night, not for a second. They sat up with their backs pressed against the rear of the lean-to and their rifles pointed out into the black. The fire built up as high as they could feed it, neither one of them saying out loud the thing they were now both absolutely thinking, because the daylight explanations were gone now. Dead and gone. Bears do not stand silently in doorways. Rival trappers do not smell like rotting death, and they do not shrug off a point-blank rifle shot and walk away. Whatever was out there in that timber was none of the things they had told themselves it was. And it knew exactly where they were. And then, finally, the sun came up. And here is the single cruelest mechanism in this entire story, the part that makes me wince every time I sit down and read it again. With the daylight pouring warm into the valley and the fire burned down to harmless gray coals and the birds starting up their ordinary morning racket in the trees, the raw terror of the night before began to feel almost foolish, almost embarrassing. The human mind does this to us. It is a survival trait that here became a trap. In the warm, ordinary light of morning, the monster at the door starts to feel like nothing more than a bad dream. The fear loses its grip. The world looks normal and safe again, and your brain, desperate to feel safe, rushes to agree with it. So the two men felt a little sheepish, if anything, a little embarrassed. Two grown, capable woodsmen who had sat up the whole night clutching their rifles and jumping at shadows. In the daylight, it seemed like an overreaction. But they were not stupid men, and I want to be fair to them. Whatever the thing actually was, foolish or not, they had decided they were finished with this valley. Good trapping or not, it was not worth this. The plan was simple and correct. They would pull their trap line, pack up everything, and get out of these mountains. That was the right call. That was the smart, experienced, sensible decision. The only problem was the timing. They were making the right decision one full day too late to save them both. And then, having made the right call, they immediately made the one fatal choice that doomed everything. To save time, to get the work done faster and get themselves out of that valley quicker, they decided to split up. Bauman would go and collect the last of the traps still scattered out along the line in the timber. His partner would stay behind at the camp to finish breaking everything down and packing it all up for the long trip out. On paper, it was a logical, efficient division of labor. In reality, it was a death sentence, and one of them just signed it. Stop and think about what they just undid in that moment. They had survived the night, both of them, for one reason and one reason only. Because they were together. Two men, two rifles, two sets of eyes watching the dark. The thing in the timber had come all the way to the very mouth of their shelter. And even then, with it right there, Bauman had been able to drive it off. Together they were a hard target. Together they had a chance. But now, in the bright and reassuring daylight, lulled into feeling safe, they pulled themselves apart. One man went walking up the trail line, alone, in among the trees. And one man stayed behind, alone, in the open clearing, with his back to the dense, silent woods. Roosevelt, writing this all down years and years later, clearly understood the terrible weight of that single decision. He lingers on it. And so should we, because the thing in the timber had been waiting for exactly this, for one of them to be alone, for one of them to turn his back.
Everything in this story has been building up to the next few minutes. Bauman finishes his work and starts back toward the camp, toward the partner who has gone very, very quiet. And this is what he found waiting for him.
So Bauman worked his way up and along the trap line, and he gathered the last of the iron, pulling and collecting the traps one by one. It took him a few hours of steady work out in the timber, and then, finished at last, he turned and started back down toward camp, back toward his partner, back toward the fire and the packed gear and the shared plan to finally get out of these cursed mountains for good. As he came down through the trees, he did the natural thing. He called out, a shout, the way you do, to let your partner know you're coming in so nobody gets startled. There was no answer, just the trees and his own voice fading. So he called again, louder this time, and again nothing came back. Nothing but the deep silence of the valley and the sound of his own boots moving through the brush. Now, a man like Bauman, a man who had lived his entire life out here, would feel the wrongness of that long before his conscious mind could even put a name to it. Your partner answers when you call. That is the deal. That is the unspoken contract between two men in dangerous country. The silence, where an answer should have been, started to climb its way up the back of his neck with every single step he took toward that clearing. And then he came out of the timber and into the camp, and he saw him. His friend was lying stretched out on the ground beside the great fallen spruce log, the one they had been using as a bench and a work table, the one sitting right there by the fire. And for one single merciful second, Bauman's mind probably tried to tell him that the man was just resting, just lying down, that everything was fine. And then the details started to arrive, one after another, and each one was worse than the one before it. The body was still warm. I need you to understand what that one fact means, standing there in that clearing. It means it had only just happened. Minutes ago, maybe. Which meant the thing that did it had been right here, in this exact spot, only moments before. Which meant it could very well still be here, right now, close, watching from somewhere in the surrounding timber while Bauman stood frozen and exposed in the open over the body of his friend. The neck was broken, snapped, and there were 4 great fang marks driven deep into the man's throat. But here is the detail that has haunted this story for well over a century now. The detail that lifts it up out of the category of an ordinary, explainable animal attack and turns it into something else entirely, something far worse. The body had not been eaten. Remember the lone trapper from the year before? The one the prospectors found half-eaten in this very same pass? That made a grim kind of sense. A predator killed him and a predator fed. But not this time. Not here. This time the thing had killed a man, broken his neck like a dry stick, torn open his throat, and then it had left every single piece of him lying untouched in the dirt. It did not kill him for food. It killed him for some other reason. And that is the thing I cannot get past, the thing that has stayed with me since the first time I read this account. We have a word for an animal that kills to eat. We do not have a word for whatever reason that thing snapped a man's neck and then simply walked away from the meat. There is no comfortable category for that. And the tracks, pressed into the soft ground all around, told Bauman the rest of it. They told him exactly how it had happened, and it is almost unbearable to picture once you let yourself see it. His partner had finished the packing, the work was done, everything was ready to go. And so the man had sat himself down on the spruce log to wait for Bauman to return, facing the warmth of the fire, with his back to the dense, dark wall of the woods behind him. He was resting. He thought the worst was finally behind them. He thought they were getting out. And out of that timber behind him, the thing had come. The track showed it plainly. It had come silently, upright on 2 legs, crossing the open ground toward the seated, unsuspecting man with long, noiseless, deliberate strides. No warning, no sound, no chance. It was on him before he ever had the slightest opportunity to turn around, to stand, to reach for a weapon, to even understand that death was crossing the clearing toward his exposed back. One moment he was warming his hands at the fire, the next it had him. Bauman did not investigate. He did not search the tree line for the thing. He did not, as a frontiersman of his skill and experience normally would have, try to track it or study the sign, or even take the time to bury his friend. Understand how significant that is. Every instinct of curiosity, of woodcraft, of duty to a fallen partner that a man like that would normally have was simply gone in an instant, burned completely away by pure, overwhelming animal terror. He grabbed his rifle and only his rifle, and he ran. He went down out of that pass at a flat, headlong run, not stopping, not looking back, not gathering gear or furs or anything else, just running until he reached the lower meadow where they had left the ponies hobbled and grazing in the grass. He threw himself onto the back of one of them and he rode. He rode through the rest of that day and on into the night, certain the entire time that something was coming behind him through the dark, pacing him, hunting him. And he did not slow down or stop until he was completely and totally beyond any possible reach of pursuit. And in his own mind, somewhere on that long, terrified ride, he had settled on what it was. He had to. The mind needs a name for things. And the name he landed on was not a bear, and it was not a man. He came to believe deep down in his bones that he had encountered something half human and half devil. a goblin beast, straight out of the old stories his people had told him as a small child by the fire in the old country. All that lore he had carried into the wilderness and sworn up and down he did not believe in, it turned out to be the only framework he had left that could possibly hold the shape of what he had just seen. So that is what he called it, for the rest of his days. And that life, the rest of his days, is where the trail goes cold on us in a way that is honestly its own quiet kind of unsettling. Because we know almost nothing about what happened to Bauman after that day in the pass. The man survived the thing in those mountains, the thing that killed his partner without effort, and then he lived out his years, grew old, and very nearly vanished from the historical record altogether. The world simply let him fade away. He carried this one searing memory inside him for decades, and then, near the very end, he handed it to the one man who would make absolutely certain it outlived them both. Now some researchers think they may have actually found him, found the real Bauman behind the story, and I want to share that with you, but I also want to be completely honest about how thin it is. There is a possibility, and it is only a possibility, that this Bauman was a real German immigrant by the name of Karl Bauman, a man recorded as being born in 1831, who came out west like so many did, and who, by one account, died in the year 1909 near Melrose, Montana. And it fits. On the surface, the German blood lines up, the era lines up, the country lines up. But we cannot prove it. Not really. It is a name that fits a shape, nothing more. We are not even fully, certainly sure of the name of the man this whole thing happened to. Think about that. The survivor of one of the most credible monster encounters in American history is himself almost as much of a ghost now as the thing that chased him down out of those mountains. He told his story and then he disappeared back into the past, leaving us with Roosevelt's pages and a handful of maybes. And that somehow makes the whole thing feel even more real and even more lonely.
Out of 600 pages of hard frontier fact, Theodore Roosevelt chose to write this one impossible story down. A future president of the United States put his name behind it. That is the detail I cannot get past, and neither should you.
So let us come all the way back around to the man who saved this story from disappearing forever. The man without whom we would never have heard a single word of it. Theodore Roosevelt published his book, The Wilderness Hunter, in 1893, years before he ever reached the presidency, back when he was building his reputation as a serious outdoorsman and naturalist. And it is a serious book. 600 pages of hunting, of careful observation of animals and landscapes, of the hard, unvarnished realities of life out on the American frontier. It is a work of fact, written by a man who prized facts. And then, sitting right there in the middle of all of it, surrounded by all that sober reality, is the Bauman story, the one single thing in the entire book that does not belong, the one account that breaks the pattern completely. And the most important thing about it is this: he did not have to include it. Nobody made him. He knew better than anyone exactly how it was going to sound coming from a man like him. A serious naturalist does not casually drop a goblin beast into his respectable memoir unless something about that story got its hooks into him and would not let go. But he looked at this tough old hunter, this Bauman, a man who, Roosevelt tells us, could barely repress a shudder, even as an old man recounting it. And he made a decision. He decided that the account was true enough and that it mattered enough to set it down in his own words and stand behind it publicly. He weighed his own reputation against this strange story, and the story won. He believed the man. That is the bottom line. A famously skeptical future. President of the United States listened to Bauman and believed him. and wrote it down so it would not be lost. And here's the nuance in how he did it that, for me personally, makes the whole thing more believable rather than less. Roosevelt never once calls the thing a Bigfoot. He never says the word Sasquatch. Those words barely existed in his time. He calls it a goblin beast, and then he just leaves it right there. Unexplained, unsolved. He does not try to tell you what it was. He is not building a creature for you. He is not selling you a legend or a theory. He is a careful, honest man reporting something that he genuinely could not account for, and then stepping back and letting it sit there in all its strangeness. That, right there, is exactly what an honest witness sounds like. Not someone with an answer, someone with a question they cannot shake. And listen, if you're finding all of this as deeply unsettling as I do me a quick favor and subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the kind of thing we dig into here. The documented cases, the ones with real, serious weight behind them. Not the noise, but the accounts that actually make you stop and wonder. And then drop me a comment down below, because I genuinely want to know what you think. What would it actually take for you to believe a story like this one? And does it change anything for you, knowing that the man who recorded it went on to lead the entire country? Because for me, honestly, it changes everything. Now let us do the part that should put a real cold chill down your spine. Let us carefully line up everything that Bauman described all the way back in the 1880s against everything that would only much later become the classic, recognized signature of these encounters. And as we do, I need you to hold one fact firmly in your mind. Bauman was describing all of this decades before the word Bigfoot was ever spoken by anyone. He had no template to follow. He had no popular legend to copy from. There was no body of lore in the broader culture for him to crib his details out of. He just told Roosevelt what happened to him. And look, just look at what he hit. The tracks pressed deep into the soft earth, made unmistakably by something walking upright on two legs. The overwhelming, rancid animal stench that announced the thing's presence before it was ever even seen. The smell that woke him from a dead sleep. The immense, impossible size of it. The great, dark bulk that completely filled the mouth of the shelter and blotted out the fire. The raw, terrifying strength, a grown and healthy man's neck snapped clean like a piece of kindling. The raiding and the deliberate, methodical wrecking of the camp while they were away. And maybe most chilling of all, the eerie intelligence of the thing. The way it came silently and patiently from behind. The way it waited for the two men to separate, for one of them to be alone and vulnerable. The way it shrugged off a point-blank rifle shot and chose to leave on its own terms rather than fleeing in pain or panic. Every single one of those details, everyone is now a textbook Bigfoot hallmark. And Bauman reported all of them together before the hallmarks existed for anyone to report. That is not nothing. That is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night if you think about it too hard. But there is one thing in this account that does not fit the usual pattern, and I refuse to smooth it over or hide it from you because it is genuinely the most disturbing part of the whole story. In the great majority of the old native stories, in most of the lore that has come down to us, these things are not murderers. They are described as elusive, strange, shy even, something to be deeply respected and carefully avoided, yes, but not as a predator that actively hunts down and kills human beings. So what on earth was different here? What was wrong with this particular one? I do not have an answer for you. I want to be straight about that. I do not have a tidy explanation that wraps it up. I just have the question, and the question simply will not leave me alone. And it points at something even darker when you set the two deaths in that pass side by side and really look at them. The lone trapper the year before was killed and then eaten. Bauman's partner was killed and then left completely untouched in the dirt. Same pass, quite possibly the very same creature. So why feed on the one and not on the other? Was the second killing not about hunger at all? If it was not for food, then what was it for? Was it about territory, a violent warning to the two intruders who had come up into its valley and refused to leave even after the first night? Was it rage? Was it something else entirely, something we genuinely do not have any human concept or category for? Some reason that exists only inside a mind we cannot begin to understand? 2 men died in that pass, a year apart, and the simple, stark difference in how they died might just be the single most frightening detail in this entire account.
Here is what still keeps me up about this case. That pass is still there. That country is still as empty. And the same reports Baumann made back in the 1880s are still coming out of those mountains today, right now.
Because here is what people so often forget about a story like this one. The Baumann account is not some sealed off piece of dusty history, a thing that happened once, long ago, and then ended and was over. That country, that exact region, is still some of the emptiest, wildest, least traveled land in the entire lower 48 states. The same black timber stands there today, the same steep, twisting, sound-swallowing valleys, the same kind of terrain where a person can walk in fully prepared and well-equipped and simply never be seen by another living soul again. The stage has not changed at all. The set is still standing exactly as it was, and the reports never stopped coming, not then and not since. From that region and from the broader sweep of the Northern Rockies and on into the Pacific Northwest, the very same signature keeps surfacing over and over, generation after generation after generation. Bipedal tracks pressed into the mud where no such tracks should exist. That same foul, unmistakable, gut-level stench. Campsites found disturbed and torn through. The crushing, undeniable sense of being watched from a stretch of timber you cannot see into. And experienced, capable, careful outdoors people who go in alone and who do not come back out. We have covered cases just like that on this channel, more than a few of them. And what gets me, what genuinely gets under my skin every time, is that the Baumann story is the thread that runs all the way back through every one of them. This is not some modern internet invention. It is not a recent hoax or a piece of viral fiction. The signature is more than 130 years old, and it was first written down not by a hoaxer or a content creator chasing clicks, but by a future president of the United States who staked his own name on it. The pattern is old, the pattern is consistent, and the pattern, even now, is still being added to. So I keep coming back to one single image, and I'm going to leave you sitting with it. Picture a man sitting on a fallen spruce log in a high mountain clearing, his hard work finally finished, the fire burning warm in front of him, his back turned to the trees. He thinks the worst is behind him now. He thinks they are getting out, that by tomorrow they will be down out of these mountains and clear this place for good. He has absolutely no idea that in the last few quiet seconds of his entire life, something is already stepping out of the timber behind him, silent, upright, patient, closing the distance across the grass with long, noiseless strides. Whatever Baumann saw filling the mouth of that lean-to in the dark, whatever it was that left those deep, two-legged tracks and snapped that man's neck without ever taking a single bite of him, it was never found. It was never identified. It was never explained. Roosevelt could not do it, and he was about as sharp and as knowledgeable a man as the age produced. Baumann could not do it, and he was the one who looked the thing directly in the face and lived. And standing here all these years later, with every piece of it laid out in front of us, neither can we. Those mountains are still there tonight. They're still dark and they are still empty. And every single year, somewhere out in country exactly like that pass, someone walks in and is never heard from again. Maybe they got lost in the timber. Maybe the cold finally took them. Maybe they slipped and fell where no one would ever find them. That is what the official story will always tell you every single time. Or maybe, just maybe, the thing that Bauman ran from never actually left those mountains at all. Maybe it is still up there, even now in the black timber. Patient, silent, waiting at the very edge of the firelight for the next man who sits down with his back to the woods.
And if you want to learn more about what lurks out there in our woods, the truth that is being hidden from us, then I suggest you take a look at the video on your screen right now.